Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Darian Burns, and I am a part of the social justice major. I'm actually a double major. I'm double majoring in urban studies and social justice and cultural studies. Initially, I was just urban studies with a sociology minor, but once the social justice major became a new option for me, it was definitely something I was interested in. The current track that I'm on is pre-law, rights, and policy. I'm a firm believer in equality, and that's always been something that's been practiced throughout my childhood, and always wanting to root for the underdog. And so definitely something I've always been interested in. This summer I had the ability to work with the mayor of Seattle downtown, and so I definitely got a look at what it was like to be inside local government, and to see how the time, how bills are passed in that way too. And so I definitely think I have an interest in policy. And so that's why I'm on this track, and I would like to see, in my future, possibly within the federal government policy work. So that's my spiel there. So, thank you.
So good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Yes. My name is Sandy Mayo, and I'm the VP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and I'm really pleased to be able to host today's event to really discuss a topic that is so critical to our work here on campus as we continue to create an environment that is truly respectful of differences and inclusive as we try to engage across differences. And so when we're talking about microaggressions, we're not talking about those overt acts of discrimination or bias. We're often talking about those subtle slights or invalidations or insults that just kind of chip away. And so they're often unconscious, unintentional. But I really like to think of microaggressions as sort of sitting on a spectrum of violence that we do to the human soul when we are not cautious about the ways that we're thinking about and understanding issues of diversity. And so I often think of Sean Harper, who's one of the preeminent scholars of racial equity in higher education. He talks about microaggressions as really being death by 1,000 paper cuts. And so it's this idea that they're sometimes minor and seemingly insignificant, but the cumulative impact becomes so important for us to understand as we're engaging issues of diversity. And so I'm really excited that we have Dr. Paul Kim with us today to share from his research to help us better understand these issues. The goal today is really for us all to be able to raise our own awareness and understanding, to listen better, to maybe gain perspective, and to be more prepared to understand how to both recognize our own participation in microaggressions and to be able to stand up when we see these subtle insults or invalidations occurring. And so I just want to share a little bit about Dr. Paul Kim, and I'm going to read from his bio so I don't miss anything important. He's a counseling psychologist with research interests in multicultural and cross-cultural psychology. And in all of his courses, Dr. Kim enjoys creating a space for students to really think about how culture relates to psychological theories and concepts, and how students can use psychology to serve the underserved and marginalized. In addition to his teaching and research, I'm just going to put a little plug in here, Dr. Kim also leads the South Korea Study Abroad program, and that will take place in the September term. So if you're interested in going to South Korea in September, talk to Dr. Kim. He's Korean by birth, but grew up in the Philippines as the child of cross-cultural missionary parents. And although he has lived in several different regions in the U.S., he certainly claims Seattle as his hometown. And he and his wife and 2 daughters are actively involved in their church. So a little bit about Dr. Kim. I'm just going to let him come up and share with us today, and we'll have opportunity to engage with questions and conversation. So thanks for coming.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's really exciting for me to be in a non-psychology classroom because that's the space I live in day in and day out. Can I get a sense of if anyone is double majoring in social justice studies and psychology? Any psych?
We have 2.
All right.
But we are welcoming more.
Got it. Yeah, and I think it's a very compatible double major.
In 4 years.
That's right. Yes. And if you are if you're interested in talking about psychology as a major, or as Dr. Mayo introduced, in the South Korea study abroad. Certainly, I'm happy to talk to you more about that. As Dr. Mayo mentioned, one of my research interests is in racial microaggressions, and I'm coming at it as a psychologist, as a counseling psychologist. So one of the things then that I'm interested in is what is the impact of microaggression? Dr. Mayo mentioned death by 1,000 cuts, right? And research indicates, as I'll show you in just a bit, that there is a cumulative effect when people experience microaggressions over and over again on one's health as well as mental health. And so we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to start out with this picture. This is an actual advertisement. I won't tell you as to what the advertisement is for. Maybe I'll ask you though. What do you guess the advertisement might be for? This was an actual advertising in a magazine for a particular type of service. What is your guess as to what the advertising is for? Anyone?
Airline.
Okay, very good. Yeah, you're correct. So airlines. In fact, this is Korean Air. And so it's an advertising in a magazine for Korean Air. And so what I would like you to do now, just for a minute or so, is to turn to the person next to you and chat a little bit about what is your reaction as you look at this ad, I'm guessing, for the first time. Like, what are some thoughts and emotions that run through your mind as you look at this particular ad? So take a minute or so to talk to the person next to you. All right, now that you've had a chance to process this image a little bit, can I get a couple of people to say what you reflected on or what you picked up on? Like, what is your reaction? And there's no wrong or right answer here, but what are some thoughts or emotions that go through your mind as you process this image, I'm guessing for the first time? What do you think? Yes?
I think one of the first things we noticed was that she's like prostrated, she's on the ground on her knees, and so it looks like she's very subservient to whoever she's serving.
Okay, so I like that word that the word that you're using to describe that, which is you're picking up on a theme where she's coming across as subservient, right? Because she's kneeling, right? What else? What other reactions do you have to this particular image? Yes, Dr. Siegel, yeah?
She's not looking at us, she's looking down.
Ah,
It
okay.
doesn't seem like the subject with a lot of power.
Got it. So the lack of power because of where the gaze is going. Thank you. Maybe one more? Yes?
The accent of color in the uniform, and so she almost seems ghost-like compared to the representation of the airline that
Got
she's, working for.
Okay. And maybe part of it is the lighting and the picture quality, but certainly the color can tell a lot regarding what kind of a impression you're trying to make with the advertising. When I show this to my psychology students, and maybe you're thinking this as well, but many of them express that they're clearly offended by this picture. And because of the subservient message that is perhaps implied here. But I give them a little more detail and I tell them, what if I were to tell you that in the Korean culture, that this is a sign of ultimate respect, that in front of someone who is, for example, elderly, someone who you are to respect, you're expected to kneel in front of them and serve and not look directly at their face, but look down. And even the way that she is holding her hand and supporting one hand with the other is part of the cultural behavior that's expected when it comes to serving someone, right? Does that change your perspective? Why or why not? A little bit, okay, so I'm seeing some nodding. And so I tell you this because for me individually, when I see this picture, I too have a strong emotion regarding, man, there are all kinds of microaggressive statements that are embedded in this particular image, right? But I also realize, and I hope that we'll all realize, that microaggressions are subtle and that the context really matters, right? And What is microaggressive to one person may not be microaggressive to another person, right? What is microaggressive in one context may not be in a different situation. And I hope we can see more examples of that as we discuss this topic. So today I just have two goals, which is, first, I want to have us think about what are microaggressions. I realize that you have a basic understanding of this, but when, I think it was in 2007, in a journal called American Psychologist, Dr. Daryl Wing Su and his colleagues, they published a very famous article on racial microaggressions. And what's unique about this journal is in the issue that follows, people can comment on the content of what's published, right? So think of it as sort of the social media comment section, but for scholars, right? And so it's always interesting to see the reaction that a particular article generates. And I was a graduate student back then, but I remember it being a very intense reaction to that particular article where one person even called it macro nonsense, right? And this is a scholar in psychology referring to this concept as pure nonsense, right? Macro nonsense. And so I think we've come a long way since then where microaggression is something that is, at least in this classroom, I have a sense that we accept that as a experiential reality that is a shared experience among people of color, right? And so we have come a long way, but I still wanted to give you some language regarding some of the types of microaggressions that psychologists often talk about, and then maybe brainstorm with you regarding what can we do in reaction to microaggression. I've always lamented the fact that we don't have a lot of literature on what do you do if you're a victim of microaggression? What do you do if you're a perpetrator of microaggression or a bystander, right? And so God answered my prayer, and in the very recent issue of American Psychologist, the whole issue is called Racial Trauma Theory, Research, and Healing. And again, Dr. Su and his colleagues have published an article that talks about some interventions for countering the effects of microaggression. So I'll share with you some, I guess, some highlights from that article, but I also want to hear from you as to what are some things that you've tried to counter microaggressions, and has that been effective or not? Okay? All right. So what are microaggressions? Well, I'll go through this quickly, but it's a contemporary form of racism, right? And so, as you know, blatant racism is still alive and well today, but on average, right, there's less likelihood because of the social pressure surrounding it, right, that people will not be blatantly racist, right, compared to more subtle, more covert forms of racism, right? And so on the left is an example of a blatant form of racism, right, where it's advertising a soap product that will make your skin lighter, right? And then on the right, some of you might remember the Dove commercial controversy where a African-American woman would take her shirt off and then transform into a white woman, right? And Dove, of course, responded with an explanation that said, we didn't intend this to be racist, right? But the impact is there is a similar sort of message regarding what is more desirable in terms of skin color, right? And that is something that is portrayed in both of these elements. By the way, this is not unique to the US setting. All over the world, there is this internalized white standard or beauty standard that says, white is more beautiful, right? And so in my culture of origin, for example, in the Korean culture, there is blatant endorsement of this where, I mean, most of you probably don't know how to read Korean, right? But if you take a look at this ad, you can guess as to what it's advertising. It's men's beauty product, right? And so, well, what do you notice about this ad? Like, what is troubling about this ad? There's several things that's troubling about this ad, but what do you notice is one thing that sort of jumps out at you?
Well, he has like a harem of white women.
Right. Right, so there's one Korean man, right, and he's surrounded by white women, right, and they're all dressed in white. And in fact, the Korean statement above the man's head says, there's no such thing that says only women have to be white, right? And so it is, again, this blatant endorsement of the beauty standard that's been internalized by, in this case, Korean culture, right? So again, this type of microaggressive statements are not unique to the US, right? But it's certainly something that we will focus on today as our setting today. So racism, again, looks very different. Overt racism is still prevalent, right? But maybe not as prevalent as it used to be. But now you have more covert intentional racism as a type of microaggression and covert unintentional racism, right? And so covert intentional might be something like a person of color goes into an elevator and there's another white person in the elevator and that white person clutches their bag a little bit tighter, right? That could be an example of covert but intentional racism. Covert unintentional might be asking like a third, fourth generation Asian American, where are you from? And they say, I'm from Seattle, and you respond with kind of a skeptical look, right? Or like you keep asking, where are you from, right? Maybe that gets into the intentional territory, right? But that's, at least initially, they are wondering where someone is from, asking that question, but that can imply a very different kind of a message than intended, right? So I wanted to pause here, because I like to do this with my students in my other classes too, where I think it's really easy to confuse impact with, or intent with validity, right? Or intent with impact. I do this too, and my young daughters, they do this all the time, where like if we say, oh, you just hurt your sister, my younger daughter might say, but I didn't mean to do that, right? And so I do this all the time, where we confuse our intention with the validity of what has happened. And I was watching football, because that's what I do when I'm trying to maybe get away from grading a little bit, right? And I was watching football, and I was in this particular incident, there was a player that got injured, a quarterback that got injured, and the analysts were analyzing whether this was a quote-unquote dirty play, right? And they were spending like 30 minutes analyzing whether this linebacker had intended to hurt the quarterback, right? But it occurred to me that regardless of whether it was a dirty hit or not, right, the outcome is the same, which is, in this case, Joe Flacco, the quarterback, was out for several games with a concussion because of the hit, right? And so I think it's really easy to confuse this. And in the spirit of vulnerability, I'll share with you, because I think Dr. Mayo mentioned this too, that like, we're all participants in this, that we're all at times microaggressors. I'm a microaggressor at times, right? And so like one time when I first came to SPU, I taught 200 students, which is very atypical of SPU, right? But my general psychology class had 200 students in the class. It was 8 a.m. in the morning, and it was in a very dark auditorium in Demeray Hall, right? And I was, kind of flustered in the middle of class, and I confused the names of 2 students of color who were sitting like right in front of me, right? Mixed their names up, right? As soon as I did that, I realized I did it. But I also found myself immediately saying, I didn't mean to do that. And it's a dark classroom at 8 a.m. in the morning. And I have 200 students in the room. And I shouldn't be expected to know all of their names, right? And these students are sitting in an area where I may not have had a chance to know their names. I came up with all these reasons as to why that behavior or that error was justified. All of which might have been true, right? But the impact was the same, which is sort of this meta communication was reinforced in that instance, which was all people of color look the same, right? Regardless of whether I believe that or not, I don't, right? The impact was something that had potentially that kind of an impact as a microaggressive statement, right? And so I challenge us to try to not confuse intent with validity, and when you catch yourself doing so, maybe counter that by thinking about the impact. I also think this is why one of the big reasons as to why people become defensive, right, when they're confronted about their microaggressions, right, and why that conversation then stops, right? Like, I didn't mean to do it, and so I don't need to talk to you anymore about this, right? So Dr. Mayo mentioned the phrase death by 1,000 cuts, right? That there is a cumulative effect. I just wanted to show you this in one slide, but if I were to do this as a comprehensive literature review, we will take up the whole time, right? That I just wanted it to have an impact that there's a host of health and mental health outcomes that are associated with racial microaggressions. Now, those of you who have taken research methods, you know that it's really hard to prove causation in psychology, right? But we also have something called predictive validity, as in X predicts Y, right? And so much of the study looks at how experience of microaggressions predicts things like sleep quality, well-being, even things like suicidal ideation. So there are both health and mental health outcomes that's predicted by people experiencing microaggressions. In fact, some people would argue, I think very convincingly, that we have to think about racial microaggressions as trauma, right? As a type of trauma that takes a toll on one's mental health. And so Dr. Nadal, Dr. Shea from School of Education knows Dr. Nadal as well, but Dr. Nadal was a graduate student of Dr. Su, so he is also one of the more famous psychologists who does research in microaggression, and he has a recent book out that looks at microaggressions as traumatic stress, and he makes a convincing case that it's like a particular type of a traumatic event, right? That it has an impact that's a lot like PTSD, right? All right. Any questions so far before I jump into the next slide? All right. So I also wanted to briefly give you Sue's definition of microaggression, which I think you have a sense as to what that is, but then kind of go off of it and talk about some implications. So the first thing is that microaggressions are brief, denigrating messages that are sent to people of color due to their minority status, right? And they may be intentional or unintentional. And so the first word that you might notice there is it's very brief, right? It's not prolonged where you have a chance to process it and you have a chance to even confront the aggressor. And so let's see. So to pause for thought, that means that because it's so brief, it's often the recipient of the microaggression that has to deal with the aftermath, including the emotional aftermath of the microaggression, right? And I think some of you have experienced microaggressions before. You can relate to that, where by the time you've sort of gathered yourself, the person has moved on from that situation, right? Researchers have called this the freeze effect, where you're literally frozen and wondering what just happened, right? And by the time you're able to gather yourself, you can no longer perhaps confront that person. And so I have kind of a silly example and then a more serious example. And so the silly example is one day I was coming to Otto Miller Hall to teach, and you know how there's like a wave of students that exit and then a wave of students that go in. It's a really big group of students and it's very chaotic, right? You're passing each other by, sometimes saying hello to each other. Well, this one student, as I was walking, thinking about my lecture, as he was passing me by, like tapped me on the chest really hard, like a few times, right? And you know, we're walking super fast, right? And I'm alarmed, and I turn around, and the student also turns around, and our eyes meet. In that split second, I can tell the student realized he had the wrong person, right? And so my guess is in that instant, he thought that I was like a dorm mate of his, right? Or a friend of his that was very familiar to him, right? It was a very friendly pat. It didn't hurt, right? But that was the moment I realized what just happened, and then I was able to process, and by then, the interaction was long over, right? Let's see. Maybe not as silly of an example, but one time I had a colleague who I respect very much. We were chatting after Thanksgiving, and he casually said, as we were parting ways, oh, and I bet you had really good Chinese food over Thanksgiving, right? By the time we said goodbye, or by the time he said this and he walked away, I was wondering, what just happened? Wait, did he just say Chinese food, right? And so I was sitting in my office, just wondering, but this colleague knows that I'm Korean, right? But then he emailed me. Like, I saw an email come in right away, and he said, I know you're Korean. There's no excuse for my error, and I just messed up, and I'm sorry, right? And so I thought that was a really good repair, a simple repair, but a very powerful one, where I feel like if it didn't take that time to repair that moment, right, it would have been, for me, something that left a lasting image, right? That this colleague who knows that I'm Korean just said, I probably had Chinese food over Thanksgiving, right? And so I really appreciated that he was able to counter the fact that often it's the recipient of the microaggression that is left to deal with the aftermath. The other part is, as again Dr. Mayo noted, this is not a one-time thing, but it's a cumulative experience. And so it's an everyday exchange, and it doesn't mean literally on a daily basis, but although research indicates that for many individuals of color, right, it is a daily occurrence, but it's a frequent occurrence where it builds up, right? And so the different analogy I thought about was, again, thinking about my own daughter, who one of the things she likes to do is, as a toddler, I don't even know what this is called, but that white piece of wood that is part of the stairs, she would hang on it, right? And it was fine when she was much lighter, right? But as she got older and older, it's like she would do this on a daily basis to the wood, right? And one day, one cracked, right? Another day, the other cracked, right? And she keeps doing this, right? Thinking, she keeps doing it, yeah, and she's now a first grader, but she keeps doing it, thinking that, hey, I did it once and it's not doing anything, right? So it must be okay, where these everyday exchanges with the wood, right, is having this detrimental impact, right? So sort of think of it as, if the analogy, death by 1,000 cuts does it for you, that's great. If not, think about the wood that my daughter keeps shaking and hanging on, right? And finally, at least according to Sue, microaggressions are specific to the experiences of people of color, right? And so I have a question for you, and that is, can white people experience microaggressions? Why or why not? So can white individuals also experience microaggressions? Why or why not? Yes? Yeah. Or are you raising your hand? No. Oh, okay. Sorry. You can. Yes?
I was going to say no because the power dynamic is different. It's, you might make a comment that, I don't know, if there's something really at stake there,
So you're referring to...
That'd be a good comment, yeah.
Got it, yeah. So you're referring to the power dynamic that might exist, where people in majority culture have more power, and therefore it's a little bit different regarding what their experience is like, okay? Yes?
Well, I was thinking, are you talking about other kinds of microaggressions or just racial microaggressions?
Good question. I'm talking about racial microaggression. Like, can you, okay, so you would agree with her, yeah, okay. Any other thoughts?
Well,
I've
heard from a person, kind of a disparaging comment about like old white males, those kinds of things, and as a kind of generalization. And so instead of considering like the particular contribution, say, of a person, it's a generalization, and I didn't necessarily appreciate it because I didn't think it was very sophisticated on one hand.
Right.
And then it was also, in a sense, well, my first thought is, well, that's sort of, what about the care and the, what about, for instance, what about my identity as like a father, where I try to dispense some care towards raising my children? Like I'm not sort of emulating old white male. That's me as a dad. And so when you drill down into the particulars, it's like some of those generalizations start to fall apart. In a sense, I don't know if it's a microaggression, but it wasn't. It didn't seem like a sophisticated critique.
Right. It was a
And that-
stereotyping that was not true for you, right? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Anyone else?
So is there a difference between stereotyping and racial aggressions? Or any microaggression? The stereotyping
Right.
sounds like it's about similar.
Right. That's a good question. I think racial microaggressions would be more, so part of it is relying on stereotypes, right? But also that it is a frequent experience, as in someone on a day-to-day basis, as part of their everyday living, experiences racial or slights based on their racial or ethnic status, right? And so it's the frequency of the experience that I think perhaps sets apart stereotyping and microaggression. It is also, stereotyping is, it's cognitive in the sense that you're taking mental shortcuts regarding what the other person is like, and the expression of that through behavior might lead to a microaggressive statement, right? But stereotyping by itself tends to be more of a cognitive emphasis, like you're doing things so that you can make sense of a situation, or you're quickly jumping to a conclusion about the other person. But certainly when you express that, that can turn into a microaggression. Yeah.
I would add that if frequency is part of how you define microaggression, then at least in my recollection, it's not happened more than a handful of times. So in that sense, it might be more like stereotype versus microaggression. If microaggression is like, it's got to be dozens and dozens, or it's got to be frequent enough that it's just all the time. At least for me, those comments, like disparaging sort of generalizations about old white males, it's not been frequent.
Right.
You know, less than a handful of times I would not say it's frequent.
I appreciate you pointing that out, that the frequency might differ, right, when it comes to those experiences of slights or insults based on your cultural background.
I mean, I've been insulted in other ways, but it's not been, you know.
Yes.
I just had something to add about the fact that the minority culture, or cultures, because there's multiple, are under a system of racism and a systematic thing. So even if they're getting, like maybe they only get a few microaggressions, like frequency, they still have to deal with the system of blatant racism and blatant systematic racism every single day. That if someone said something to me, even as a woman, so like a microaggressive toward me as a woman, I still have the benefit and the privilege of being in a system that helps me, you know? So I'm not sure still where that stands of stereotyping versus microaggression, but I just, like, in my core, I feel like it's not possible because we're still operating under a system that helps us.
Got it. Okay. Very well put. Yeah. So you're again referring to the power dynamics and systemic privilege that might almost buffer against the detrimental impact of a microaggressive statement or a stereotyping statement. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Can I give you some examples of a couple of different types of microaggressions, and then we'll talk about what we can do to counter those different types. And so Su et al., they talk about two large umbrellas or categories of microaggression. One is invalidations, right? So as the name implies, invalidation is where the statement or behavior sends a message that what the person's experiencing is not valid, or maybe they're not as welcome of a citizen in this country compared to, for example, whites. And so alien in one's own land is the name that Su gives to one type of micro-invalidation, that there are statements, microaggressive statements, that sends the message that you are an alien in one's own land. Another phrase that's often used is perpetual foreigner stereotype, right? And so the question, where are you from, is an example of that, right? Where, again, the intent might be to get to know the other person, right? But there might be an underlying assumption that the other person is a foreigner, someone who is from outside of the US, someone being complimented on their English, right? When they are maybe third and fourth generation Asian American, that's an example of, again, an alien in one's own land stereotype. Some of you might have seen this. I just wanted to show you a brief clip. I'm hoping the video works. If not, okay, so the video is not pulling up, but that's okay. It's a video of somebody in a very comical way talking to this white person who, well, not that part, but who compliments them under English, right? So this Korean American woman then counters with some really funny, but I think very thoughtful remarks as well. And so you can look that up on YouTube. But racial color blindness is another type of micro-invalidation. And I think on the surface, color blindness can look good, right? And especially when the faith perspective is wrongly applied and we say, oh yeah, God tells us to love everyone, and so when I see you, I don't see you as a person of color, but I see you as a person, as a child of God, right? Again, it's well intended, but it also invalidates the other person's experiential reality, right, as a person of color, right? And so color blindness is another invalidation. And then finally, myth of meritocracy or denial of racism might be another one where, so they go in hand, but meritocracy would be, well, everyone can pull themselves up by the bootstraps and work hard enough to overcome their challenges, right? And so another area of research that I'm conducting is looking at this model minority stereotype that Asian Americans are considered the model minority compared to the other minority groups, right? It's this idea that Asians are being used to say, hey, there is no racism, Asians have achieved, right? And therefore, all the other minority groups should also be able to achieve, right? And so even a positive stereotype or seemingly positive stereotype like the model minority stereotype is a micro-invalidation or invalidation of the experiences of communities of color. Denial of racism might be things like if you share with a therapist or a counselor and they say about an incident of microaggression and they say to you, oh, you're being too sensitive. If you share with a teacher and they say, maybe you can look at it this way. Well, that is an example where your experience of racism has been invalidated, right? Franklin Graham, several years ago, posted on his Facebook, and I'll just read you a couple of lines. This is when there was a lot of discussions about police brutality, right? And young black males being targeted by police. And he says here, listen up, blacks, whites, Latinos, and everyone else. Most police shootings can be avoided. It comes down to respect for authority and obedience. If a police officer tells you to stop, and then later in all caps, you obey, right? And so that's an example of denial of structural inequality, of racism that might unconsciously or consciously bias law enforcement officials, right? And so I wanted to share that with you as an example of denial of individual racism. I also realized we have until 1:20, so I wanted to skip ahead to talk about some ideas you have for countering microaggressions. So can I give you a couple of scenarios? So let's see. These are again scenarios from the hot off the press article that I talked to you about. But here's one scenario. What might you do if you're a witness to this? And then what might you do if you were the recipient or the target of this microaggression? And so think about it and then turn to the person next to you and share a little bit, and then we'll come back together. But what might you do if you were a witness to this or if you were the target in this particular situation? So turn to the person next to you and share some thoughts regarding what you might do. Okay, I hear lots of good conversations. So I'm gonna see if I can get maybe one or two responses. What might you do in a situation like this? You're either a bystander or you're the target of this. How might you respond, if at all, in a situation like this? And by the way, what is sort of the meta communication here? If someone behaves this way, what is the underlying message?
That white is safe and anything else is not.
Right. Or sort of a variant of that would be all people of color, or in this case, black males are dangerous, right, and potentially criminals, right? And so that's sort of the meta communication here that's being conveyed. And so what might you do to counter that? What do you think? How might you respond? Yes?
Well, overall, I feel like I would be scared to encounter either one, especially if they're a stranger. But one example I thought of was to address him and kind of make him seem like a normal person and kind of, say, hey, how's it going? Or to kind of de-escalate the fear of him.
Got it. It's very
But I
good.
think
So-
in general,
Yeah.
would be nervous even.
Sure. And that's really important to keep in mind, which is context matters, right? And safety matters, right? And so you might assess how safe is it to engage this couple, if at all, right? But also you're, as a bystander, keeping in mind the person that might be impacted, the target, right? And so I really liked your suggestions. What else? What else might you do? Yes?
That sort of makes me wonder,
Yeah.
is there an opposite of a microaggression?
Say more about that.
Well, I mean, that seems like what we're trying to do here. I'm trying to, negate that microaggression you just felt by doing the opposite. Is that
Right.
Is it even possible?
Right. So going against the stereotype, right? Or like you mentioned, maybe intentionally engaging the person in a way that makes them feel validated. Yeah. Is that sort of what you're getting at? Yeah. Yeah. What other things came up in your discussions? What might you do in a situation like this? Yes. Yes.
So David and I talked about getting closer to the black man.
Ah, okay.
So the other woman goes closer to
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
to the other person, so then we go the other way.
Right, right. Yeah, sort of like what you're suggesting, right? Yeah.
I was thinking, so we talked about similar in like, as a bystander to maybe acknowledge the black male and like, because, I don't know how to say this, like, typically black men are criminalized and appear like seemingly, or how is this, perceived as dangerous. That's the stereotype of black
Right.
male. And so definitely like acknowledging them and greeting them, letting them know that you see them as like a human because they face dehumanization on a daily basis, I think would be an important part. But also I feel like this would vary obviously by person and individual, but I think as the African American male, I think it might even be powerful for them to acknowledge the other person or the woman and the male and her partner and say like, hello, like to kind of show them like I see you,
Right.
almost, and like a kind of flipping the like a power dynamic that's happened there. Maybe that could be something powerful too.
No, that's really excellent because Sue in his article talks about that where they call it disarming or making the invisible visible by, for example, maybe the target might actually converse with the couple, right? Or even say things like, relax, I'm not dangerous, right? In a way that makes the meta communication very visible and names it, right? But in a way that maybe disarms the situation as well. Yeah. Okay. I have. Oh, yeah.
Well, this is actually, but
Shared idea.
we had mentioned that we talked about it's a similar concept, but instead of just like starting a conversation, depending on how aggressive you want to be, to like call it out and be like to the African American male, like, isn't it uncomfortable, like to just call her out,
Right.
to call the white woman out on that action, but like addressing it to the man, to the African American man, like, does this make you uncomfortable? When people like automatically just stereotype
Right.
you as this is what you are. Just depending on how passive aggressive you want to be.
Right. But it's also a way to educate a person, right? If you really wanted to do that, it's a way that could potentially get through to them, at least plant that seed in them, right? Well, I also know that there's another class that's coming in here at 1:30, right? Dr. Siegel, is that true? 1:30? Yeah, so I think we have to wrap up. But I just had this one quote that actually was part of a sort of a rejoinder or response to the many critiques of microaggressions. So Dr. Su says, the true tale of the lion hunt will never be told as long as the hunter keeps telling the story. And it's from an African proverb. And I think it's a telling quote for us to wrap up with, which is, I hope that as you continue these conversations, that you keep telling the story and that you recognize that this is an experiential reality that's true for you and for many others who are around you as well. And I'm sorry, the time goes by really fast when you're having fun, but hopefully we can continue these conversations in other settings. Thank you.